Proverbs 15 verse 1, a gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger.
Hello and welcome to the Church Society podcast. I'm Ros Clarke. I'm the Associate Director of the Church Society and your host here on these podcasts. I'm joined this week by Amanda, who's been on the podcast before, and by Martin, who's joining our podcast team. Martin, just tell us who you are, what do you do, what does lockdown look like for you these last couple of months?
Thanks, Ros. Yeah, I'm Martin, and I'm the rector of a church in Thiel, West Berkshire, about 5 miles west of Reading, called Holy Trinity Church. And I'm here, well, I've been here since September last year with my family, my wife, Lisa, and my daughter, Elizabeth, and my son, Alexander. And well, this is the first day, actually, since the lockdown happened, that Lisa is upstairs working and I'm downstairs working without our children in the house, because my daughter's back at school and my son has started nursery again.
Great.
So we have, I'm hoping for, fewer evenings of work. Of the intensity that it's been over the last few weeks because of homeschooling.
Great. So slightly more normal and maybe slightly quieter household during the day. Lovely.
During the day,
well, it's good to have you with us. So today we're going to be talking a little bit later about cancel culture and our addiction to outrage on social media. But we're going to begin by talking about some announcements that have been made by various dioceses in the Church of England in the last week or so. Particularly Chelmsford Diocese made quite a stark announcement about their plans for future clergy. So I think they had already announced plans for reducing the number of clergy by the end of 2025, but those have been brought forward to within the next 18 months or so. By the end of 2021, they plan to have reduced their number of stipendiary paid clergy by over 20%. That's quite a significant amount. And as I say, I know other dioceses are also making plans, having to alter plans, consulting and thinking about how things are moving forward. I guess some of that is very obvious. Why? That everything is has had an impact from coronavirus and lockdown, not least church giving and funding, and also dioceses tend to have a lot of their resources sort of tied up in stocks and shares, which will have seen a hit in the last few months. But this is not just about what's happened in the last few months, is it, Amanda?
No, it's been going on for a long time, hasn't it? That dioceses have faced financial problems as the number of people coming to church decreases, so that people aren't giving, so there's not a large number of people giving small amounts. It does. And Sheffield's been doing this for quite a while. They've been going through a process, and I know our deanery went through this process. I think when we first arrived about 10 years ago, there was a sort of clergy reduction programme.
And some of that is to do with finance, but also some of that is to do with people, isn't it? So I know when I was working for the diocese, there was this sort of constant, how can we be equipping and enabling more lay people, which is terrific. But actually what they wanted was them to be equipped and able to do with things that we would normally think of as clergy roles. So taking funerals, for example, or other occasional offices, or, how could lay people be doing that? Why is there such a problem with clergy staffing and numbers? Are we just not getting people wanting to train for ministry? Blank silence.
Well, I think there are people wanting to train for ministry, but there's also, of course, as evangelicals, as a tribe, if I can put it that way, we do put a lot of stock in putting people forward who we have considered, are going to preach clearly and love faithfully, and so we don't sort of just send off people to theological college unthinkingly. So there is, if you like, it's a question: is there sort of a backlog of moving people towards the DDA stage as we, as church leaders, consider who we should be sending. Maybe that's an issue.
I think it could be, and I think there's an issue there, particularly for evangelicals, that I wonder if sometimes we forget that at the point where you send someone to go and talk to a DDO, they could be, you know, what, a year or two away from going to a BAP, 3 years at college, 3 years or 4 years in a curacy, you know, 7 or 8 years potentially before that person's becoming an incumbent. They don't have to be ready to become an incumbent at the beginning of that process. And I think sometimes we are a bit guilty of looking for the finished product.
Yeah, and that's a particular challenge if you're looking at someone who's young, which is the ideal age actually to go into ministry. Well, not, you don't have to be super young, but it is better to be in terms of longevity of ministry and your what you develop along along those times is, and young people are, you know, less ready and fully formed. So
yeah,
and I know there was a sort of the Church of England had a real phase of basically telling people to go out and get jobs and then come back to ministry, and then they suddenly realised that people weren't coming back later. So there was a season of, you know, 50 years ago, probably, you know, 18, 20-year-olds were coming forward and they were sending them for ordination. And then they went through a phase of saying, oh, you're too naive, go and get a job. And then they didn't come back. And then
or if they do come back, you train someone when they're, I don't know, in their mid-40s or in their mid-50s, you get a lot fewer years back in terms of your investment. And I think that's something we do see, is a lot of people going through for selection for ordination in their middle age, and they may be great, but what we really love is to have another 20 or 30 years of them, and to do that they need to go younger. So there are some issues. There are long-term issues about money, long-term issues about recruitment, but also some immediate pressures of the current financial situation. What would we like to see dioceses setting as their priorities for that? And, you know, it's easy to say that clergy are the easy target, and to some extent that may be true, although it's not that straightforward to make clergy redundant. But if you were sort of CEO of a diocese, what would be the kind of priorities you'd want to set, given limited budgets and potentially limited staffing? What would we love them to be considering?
Well, of course, it is the gospel that grows the church, isn't it? So, you know, we can have an awful lot of action plans to do with strategic growth and ways of handling the building and so on. But you know, the vast majority of money that goes into a diocese comes from giving. And you know, we're currently working here at Holy Trinity on that mindset shift of the loose change in your pocket, sort of you know, spasmodic giving, to the planned, prayerful. I'm responding to the gospel because I've been saved when I didn't deserve it, so I'm going to do the same with what I have been given from God. So part of it is discipleship, isn't it? And it's and so we need leadership from the top of what discipleship looks like, not just in terms of, you know, we hear an awful lot, don't we, of like incarnational ministries and things like that. But what we need from the leadership is a reinvigoration of how it looks to respond to the gospel with every area of my life. Christ moves in, and he's in charge of every room of my house. What does that now look like practically? There's one for starters.
Yeah, absolutely. And you see that, don't you, in churches where there is real gospel ministry and the congregation is growing, not just in numbers but in maturity, that has a discernible impact on the financial viability of that church. And it is one of the things that is quite distinctive about the Church of England, certainly in this country, is that churches don't necessarily have to be financially viable on their own terms. There is this sort of central way in which churches contribute towards dioceses and then dioceses pay stipends that isn't necessarily one-on-one thing, and maybe shields some congregations from that reality. Amanda, what would be your recommendation of ways forward for the diocese?
I mean, I think that is the key, is that discipleship, which leads to people giving. But I think there's a sort of there's a big issue. The thing that sort of, as congregations, we pay the stipend, and then we're paying for our building. And so many church buildings are, historic antiquities in their area and much beloved of the local population, but not to the extent that they're going to give for it. And it's sort of working out how our relationship with our building, and whether we can close some of them at minimal cost, in order to, because actually it's so much more encouraging if you've got 3 churches of 20 people in a rural benefice. If 60 people got together in a church for a church service, that it brings its own dynamic of growth and discipleship as you disciple one another, doesn't it? To bring the people together out.
It's very hard, because often there will be a period of that looking like it doesn't work, because not all of those 60 people will go. There will be people who feel very strongly attached to their parish and their church, who just won't go somewhere else. And that sort of pruning is painful. But I just, if you were starting to do the Church of England now and draw parish boundaries now, you would not draw them. I mean, it would just
no. It's that the buildings are in the wrong places.
Exactly,
really and badly designed. Yeah.
At some point, there needs to be that really painful work of shaking all of that up and saying, this is just unsustainable, and it's not serving people who live in urban parishes. It's not serving people well who live in rural communities either, where very few of them are suddenly having to try and pay for upkeep of very expensive ancient buildings that they don't really need. And
it's interesting, isn't it? Because on one level, when it comes to if we as a church, and I think a number of churches will identify with this, knew that the parish share was only going, I mean, this is a whole other issue, but if we knew that the parish share was only going to churches that were faithfully preaching the gospel, I think it would make a big difference, because we consider, don't we, how God is a God of the nations, and how we are, we're not just, the Christianity, we're brothers and sisters with people all around the world. And so we give sacrificially, not just for the gospel here, but for outside of the UK as well, and all the rest of it. Well, that sort of mentality, in one sense, should be localized. We should be able to say, well, I'm giving, but it's not all going here. It's going, to other churches in the north, down the south, but that's okay, because the gospel is being served there. But there's that frustration and feeling of, we're giving money that is not being used for the gospel, and that makes a huge difference to how PCCs, particularly those PCCs who are confident in what gospel money should be used for, makes them very nervous about the parish share.
I think that's right. And I think, we need to, that sort of how we have gospel priorities will work out in different sorts of ways. And it's not that buildings, for example, have no value in gospel ministry. We've all noticed in the last 3 months that our ministry has been changed, and in some ways it's been great, but there have been things we've been lost by not being able to be in our buildings and so on. And it's right that dioceses are able to do a certain amount of the support work they do, and somebody needs to pay for that, and so there's different kind of things. But it would be great to see dioceses, I think, recognizing that there are other places as well, as that there may need to be some clergy cuts, but I'd love them to be just thinking bigger and bolder and braver about things like some of the buildings. Do they need all their diocesan officers? Could there be a culling of senior staff? For example, does it all need to be parish clergy where all the cuts are being made? And I think, a sort of sense of what are we actually working towards that we hope will be a pruned and more focused gospel presence for the Church of England in our diocese going forward, even though some of that will be difficult to get there.
It's a massive challenge, isn't it? If you were going to design a church for England, Church of England, you would not start where we are now.
No.
Now, how do you make the church fit for the purpose? Is the Church of England ever going to be able to make itself fit for purpose this century? It's hard. It's really hard to know whether it's possible.
Yes, it is, and
I think that's
right.
where, yeah, but that's then where things like securing succession and localized gospel partnerships come into play, I think. So as I was musing on this over the last couple of days, this isn't one of those issues where it's us versus them sort of an issue. Everyone in the Church of England are in the same boat. All churches are struggling financially, or all churches could be affected by the financial difficulties. And whilst we have large gospel partnerships, large organized gospel partnerships, north, south, east, west, one of the things that I've really been grateful for since moving to Berkshire has been those clergy who are busy in their own right and they've got lots to do, and they've said, you're new, you need support and help, and how can we help you? How can I build your ministry up? How can I ensure that when you go on holiday you're confident you've got a preacher and all that sort of stuff? But on top of that, one day I'll leave, and not announcing my retirement, but one day I'll leave, and when that happens, two things need to happen. One, I need to have secured my PCC, and two, I need to have secured my succession. Knowing that I'm not going to be involved in the process, I need to know that the PCC are confident in what gospel leadership should look like and what they should be asking for. And securing my succession, they and the church should be itching for not what itching ears want to hear, but for faithful gospel proclamation. So we, I've got something here. Crumbs. My studies are a right mess. What do we use? We use as a PCC. There it is. Gospel-centered church as part of our away days. And it's just really helpful to keep the main thing, because our PCC is a great diversity of people with all sorts of backgrounds. But how do we sort of zone in on what the main thing is? Yeah, and that's one way.
Yeah, I'm thinking about doing that. I think you're exactly right about succession, but also thinking about that in terms of finances and what that will look like as things do get more stretched and more pushed. Having PCCs, and also people, if you've got people in your congregations who would be equipped to sit, for example, on a diocesan board of finance or committees at those sorts of levels, then do encourage them, because we need people with really clear gospel priorities to be making those kinds of decisions, not just at parish level, but at a wider level as well. Well, no doubt there will be more of this coming and more to talk about as things progress in the next year or two. Good. So I'm slightly dreading talking about this next time, but it's been such a thing that it felt really important to say. So many of you, I guess, will have seen, heard about, or perhaps read J.K. Rowling's piece that she wrote a week or so ago, defending her position on transgender. And we're not going to talk about transgender particularly, but what I did want us to talk about was the kind of thing which both prompted her to write that and the response there has been, the sort of, I think the term for it is cancel culture. She is cancelled. You wouldn't invite her to speak, you don't listen to her, you don't read her books because of her views on transgender. And it seems to be this kind of addiction that we have to outrage. Nothing can just be disagreed with, or nobody can be just disagreed with. They have to be cancelled, and there has to be outrage, and you have to show how much you disagree with somebody. where has all that come from? Have we always been that outraged at people we disagree with? Amanda, have you always been outraged?
I'm actually quite an outraged person. I've sort of got I've got quite a lot of fire in my belly particularly about justice and truth, and I can get really angry and animated. I'm a real gut person. But when I was a student, I would have to read a newspaper, or I would have to read a book, and I would have to have a conversation with someone, and then I would become outraged. About poverty was something I was very passionate about, and the developing world when I was a student. And now you can be outraged by a tweet. So the sort of the attention span of the things that cause outrage, and then there isn't that depth of thinking in engaging with an issue so I've had my daughter's 18, and she's quite like me with knobs on, in fact, and she gets outraged about injustice and things that are wrong, and she gets her news and her information about these things on Instagram, and she's not very good at engaging deeply, but so trying to so that's one of the issues, that we digest things in much smaller bites.
Yeah, so there's two issues there, aren't there? There's what news we're actually getting may not be all that accurate or nuanced, and maybe out of context, because social media requires it to be so short and so dramatic. But then also the way we respond to it is influenced by social media. Martin, is this something that you've noticed happening in that sort of way?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's a whole issue, isn't there, of the lack of backstory.
Yeah.
That you people are not willing to even engage in. They're not, it's not even on their minds when they read a tweet. There's only so many characters, and there's no nuance. And with the J.K. Rowling piece, what was really fascinating was, if you've read it, you'll have seen that she had inadvertently liked something when she meant to take a screenshot. Well, there was no question, no, why did you do that? No, what has led you to do that from your past? And there's no care for the backstory. It's just anger, hate, pile-on, and then cancel.
And pile-on is another really big thing as well, isn't it? So, Amanda, if we imagine back in the day, it's quite a long way back, and some of us may not really remember this far back when you were a student, but, if you wanted to express your outrage, you had to go on a march, or you had to write.
You'd have to organise people. You'd have to go door to door getting a petition signed, not just like send it out on your social media and tell everyone to sign it.
Exactly. And if it was just something that had come up in a conversation, you might express your outrage to the friend. But what you didn't then have was 10,000 other people who'd heard you say that and say, yes, I agree. Yes, you're awful as well. And I don't know how you deal with that problem on social media, but I'm really conscious of it as a thing that actually may be a perfectly valid response when one or two people say it, really does become very oppressive when thousands and thousands and thousands of people are all repeating the same thing.
There is an excellent clip, which we'll link to on the programme notes, of President Obama being asked about cancel culture. Just a couple of minutes of him talking about that. They talk about how the world is messy and people are complicated. Good people do bad things. Bad people love their children. These sort of people are not black or white. But also, I thought the really important thing that he said is that you don't change things by judgment. You don't. If you want to change the world, you don't do it by tweeting. You do it by actually doing something, by legislation, by doing boring stuff, sitting in committee meetings, doing the hard back work. Because actually, Twitter doesn't really change things.
No, absolutely. And I think we do see that, which is why the same things cycle round again and again. I mean, the George Floyd murder obviously provoked a whole outrage of social media over the last few weeks. But it's not the first time that has happened. It's not the first time the internet has been outraged at racism, or even that particular kind of racism in sort of American policing, and yet it's still happening. it hasn't changed the world, and it's I think not going to change the world, is it? One of the things I've been reading about and thinking about around this, which I am really not an expert on, and I want to be really clear to our regular listeners, we are not generally experts on most of the things we're talking about. We are chewing the fat and kind of having thoughts, and we hope there's some useful things in there, but please don't think we are setting ourselves up as experts. But the influence of what I believe used to be called cultural Marxism, but now is more generally known as critical theory, which is a way of sort of viewing the world from a number of different angles as split between people who are oppressed and people who are the oppressors. So you see it in racism, so black people are cast as the oppressed and white people as the oppressors. Women would be the oppressed and men would be the oppressors. On gender issues, straight people are the oppressors, and anyone who is not straight in whatever way is somehow the oppressed. And everything is viewed in this sort of way of them and us, oppressor and oppressed. But the thing, as far as I can see, that critical theory doesn't seem to do is offer any way out of that. It's a way of observing injustice, and sometimes very real injustice, and being outraged by it, but not then really moving on from it. And I just don't see how that helps us at all, really, with these kind of things, sometimes, which are quite rightly things that we should be outraged and horrified by, but we don't really get past that. How can we do better? How can we as Christians engage, or should we bother to engage when there is this kind of outcry? Martin, what would you suggest?
Should we engage? Yes, we should engage. We are called Matthew chapter 5, isn't it? The Beatitudes, Sermon on the Mount. We are called to be salt and light. We are called to bring that which gives life into that which can decay. Mm-hmm. So we are not called to sort of take a step back and look at the decay and say, isn't that a shame? We are called to speak words of life, and they're the words of Christ. Mm-hmm. The book of Proverbs is what's it touted? I'm working on Proverbs at the moment. It's just on my mind. Graham Goldsworthy has a great commentary, and he describes it as a book of Proverbs as an expression of the redeemed mind reflecting on life in this world. Mm-hmm. I think that's so helpful, because when we read Proverbs like, and I got this in front of me because I'm all prepared. When we read Proverbs like Proverbs 15 verse 1, a gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. When we read that, we realize what that means practically. To the redeemed mind, we know that anger is sinful. So we don't want that for a fellow human. That's not what we want to get out of a person, anger. And so much of social media, it seems like that is the purpose of the characters, however many characters we use to write. And we do have to start thinking, don't we, if we're not already, what is the purpose of my engagement? Is my purpose to stir anger, or is it to build up? So what is it now? Proverbs chapter 15 verse 4, a soothing tongue is a tree of life, but a perverse tongue crushes the spirit. Is our purpose to crush, or is it to build up? And that changes an awful lot, doesn't it?
Yeah, and that's really helpful, I think, in just being wise and thinking about what are we aiming for in this conversation. There have been times in the last week where I've seen some of my friends who are, very rabidly pro-transgender, and I've just thought, do I need to say something? And the reason I haven't said anything, and the reason I haven't is because I haven't been able to think, how do I say anything that isn't going to just stir up more anger? This person is already furious. They're not in a position where they're interested in listening. They're not in a position where they're interested in engaging. I can't find a way that's going to see that. So maybe it's better to say nothing at that point, but actually not to say nothing forever. Yeah. But actually pick your time as well. Amanda?
Yeah. I was going to say the verse that came to me that when I was thinking about this cancel culture is that verse in James, which is everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. Because, I mean, in the racism issue, people have been saying, people need to listen to hear what happens to people. And I think that's really important. But also these, just hearing about young people and their problems, the transgender thing is about people's problems with their identity, wondering who they are. And a lot of these issues seem to be stemming from people's lack of self-confidence, lack of knowing who they are. And maybe that's, and that's their lack of understanding that they are made in the image of God, isn't it? So there's a lot of issues in our culture which, we've got gospel answers for.
We certainly do, and there may be some opportunities to develop the kind of relationships and to speak those kind of words of truth into online engagement, but also many of those things are going to be much better done in sort of grounded face-to-face interactions, those sort of longer term issues that people have.
I think that's right. I mean, I came to the conclusion that I don't do much arguing online. I don't really do any arguing online, if I'm honest. I'm not very often seen making points or statements or anything like that on social media, partly because I'm just not very good at it, and it takes me forever to write anything, so I have to take my time. But for many, it's worth knowing, for many people, that is their audience. So for many people, how are they declaring to the world their position? How are they showing the world what they think? And we could argue they don't have to, it's okay, but people feel like they need to, so there we are. So there's Facebook and Twitter and so on. For me, and I'm sure a number of other clergy will agree, or those who do have access to a pulpit, we have another opportunity to do that. That is, again, to use that word nuance, that is more nuance, which is thought through, which gives people time to consider. I'm spending a week's worth of time considering any given sermon. So it's not just, okay, what should I say now? It's how can I say this in a way that will be faithful to the Bible, will not make the pulpit a sort of a position of what am I trying to say, issue, and where I just put an issue out without it being secured by the faithful weekly consecutive expository teaching of the Bible. And so I don't, in one sense, I don't need to do that because I don't feel that I'm not being heard. So that's a privileged position I recognize I have. But it's a good reminder that we do have that, and we therefore have to be careful about what we therefore say online.
I think that's exactly right. And I think even if you're somebody who's not a minister and a preacher in that sort of way, there are good questions to be asked about, do I have to say this? And do I have to say this here? And am I just saying this so I can be seen to have said it? Which I think a lot of the outrage culture is fueled by. And actually, it's okay to say, do you know, I don't think I have anything to contribute positively here, or that is going to build peace or build the church. So actually, I'm just going to stay quiet for a bit. And that's okay as well. Good. Well, there you go. I mean, you could just cancel all your social media accounts as well. That would be another way of doing it. I won't be doing that anytime soon. Great. So we have some recommendations. I have a couple of things. I was going to recommend a couple of podcasts. If you're listening to this, you're probably a podcast listener. So I want to recommend two things. James Carey, who is a regular guest here on the Church Society podcast and is one of the most prolific podcasters I know. So you may already be a regular listener of Cooper and Carey Have Words and various other things that he does. But he is doing a podcast this year for the Keswick Convention. Obviously, Keswick Convention is not going ahead in its normal way. They're doing a whole lot of stuff online. And one of the things that James is doing is interviewing many of their main speakers. And that is coming out as a podcast. There's some already out, and I think there are more still to come. So you might enjoy that. And I also wanted to recommend The Plumb Line. Plumline is two British women, Christians, evangelicals, chewing the fat about all kinds of issues to do with the church and theology. And it's really encouraging to me that in the last couple of years, there have been a good number of British Christian podcasts coming out. There's a lot of great stuff that comes from America, but it is quite culturally specific a lot of the time. And so I wanted to recommend the Plumline as something that is very British. And then the final thing I have, many of you may have seen over the weekend, Glenn Scrivener's new little spoken word video. This one is called Numbers, and it is just a really striking look at some of the statistics around abortion in particular. So we'll share links to those. Martin, what have you got for us?
Oh, well, I've just got one book. This is a slight cheat, really, because it's not that new, but there we are. The Prodigal Prophet by Tim Keller, who needs prayer at the moment, doesn't he? But we've just finished working our way through the book of Jonah as our sermon series. And it's strikingly appropriate for our time, because if there's it is speaking of somebody who needed to identify his blind spots. It speaks as the God of the nations. It speaks of the reality of our looking at other cultures or races or religions and thinking they are not worthy of hearing the gospel. And if we've ever found ourselves in that, or judging people on the color of their skin, it's a great reminder what Jonah, the lesson Jonah was taught about not nasal gazing at our sin and wallowing in that, but looking up to our Savior who has saved us and brought us up from the depths. And all the more we then cry out for the nations to be saved. So there we are, The Prodigal Prophet. I think it's a great book.
Terrific, yes. And for those who've not seen the news, Tim Keller posted a couple of weeks ago that he'd recently been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer and is undergoing treatment for that. I think they seem to have caught it very early, but nonetheless, do be praying for him and for Kathy. Amanda?
I've just a couple of really random things. A friend of mine mentioned to me that she was being really blessed by Ollie Knight, who's a worship leader who's done Word Alive for a few years, from Brighton, I think he is. He has been doing a daily sort of Facebook Live with his family, with singing, with music, called Come Sing With Me. And I haven't been watching that, but there's a Spotify list for Come Sing With Me. So it's a really nice list with some songs I know and some new ones as well from lockdown. So I've really been enjoying listening to that. And the other thing I've really been enjoying is I rediscovered a recipe that I had when I lived in Singapore. We've been having some barbecues, and it's for lemon rice, where you cook your rice and you add sort of various fried spices and nuts. And I just wanted to recommend to bless you with some food. I'm going to blog it on my blog today. So
good. So there will be a link.
That,
a link to that recipe that I think
eat good food. Yeah,
that sounds amazing. I think you might have cooked that for me before. It sounds amazing. Great. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for listening. We'd love it if you listen to this podcast via an app that allows you to rate the podcast. We'd love it if you would do that, or if you want to leave a review. If you're on YouTube, you might want to leave a comment. All of those things help move the podcast through the algorithms and get it recommended to more people who might enjoy it. So it'd be a real help to us if you're able to take a moment to review and or rate the podcast. I mean, we'd love it if you give us 5 stars, but if you think it's only mediocre, even a 2 or 3 star rating all helps to show that people have been listening and engaging with it. Going to be back next week with something that will be a little bit different from our normal podcast. Next Monday, we are launching Church Society's latest publication. It's a book called Walk This Way. It is reflections on the Apostles' Creed, the 10 Commandments, and the Lord's Prayer. There are also short chapters introducing baptism and the Lord's Supper, explaining what church is, and there's a short catechism in that as well. So it's an ideal book for anyone who is relatively new to the faith, be a terrific thing to give someone as they're preparing for confirmation, but also for those of us who are perhaps more mature in our faith to be reminded and refreshed by some of those basics of what it means for Christians to live and to pray and to believe. So we'll be here next week, hopefully with all of the authors of that book, and letting you know more about it and where you can buy it and so on. So that'll be next Tuesday. Good. Right. Thanks so much.